Azure Dragon, White Tiger, Black Tortoise.
Bird.
Long ago, the four nations lived together in harmony. Then, everything changed when the Militesi attacked. Only Class Zero, having the ability to use magic independent of the crystal, could stop them. And when the world needed them most, they were there. So, they're gonna save the world. So I am back with the Final Fantasy grind with Final Fantasy Type 0 HD, which will probably be the last Final Fantasy I'll cover before the big 16. But I could possibly cram one more in if y'all like, just let me know. Anyway, Final Fantasy Type 0, another game where the Imperial Empire seeks world domination, but instead of taking them on as a boy band or sky pirates, we follow a group of kids that make up a unique class of superheroes from academia, a magic academy under the Vermilion Bird Nation. The White Tigers are the Imperials, and these are the two nations that are predominantly at play. The Azure Dragon and Black Tortoise aren't nearly as prevalent, especially the Black Tortoise, as they immediately get wiped out by the Militesi as soon as the game starts. They're pretty much the Air Nation. That's basically the story setup, and to start off, I know Final Fantasy as an anthology franchise likes to have recurring elements such as chocobos, a character named Sid, and but I would kinda like them to stop telling stories that involve the protagonist having to stop the Imperial Empire from taking over the world. It's getting a little old and wasn't all that compelling the first time. At least the other entries with this kind of story had a more charming cast. This game has people. Characters? Not really. I cannot tell you half the names of this game's cast of 14 playable characters. They all look like generic anime characters, and the matching uniforms don't help. During the initial hours, there were a lot of scenes where I was like, are you the same person from... I think you might be. Now, the cadets do have distinct personalities. Like King is the stern member with a deep voice, 9 is the angry hothead, Sync is the one that talks like this. Very slow with the drowsy tone, and every time she opens her mouth I want to die. But very few of them have anything going on story-wise that defines their character. The only ones that do are Machina and Rem, and that's mostly because they're like the new recruits. They're not part of the original 12 cadets that were adopted and raised by the mysterious Dr. Aresha. Speaking of, I feel like everyone outside of Class Zero are the more interesting characters, having their own roles and personal motivations. Class Zero is portrayed more as a tool that just does all the fighting, which was purposely done to set up the particular theme of free will, but it's honestly better to look at this group just as one character rather than 14. In fact, that's how the game itself kind of treats them. No matter who you're actively controlling, whenever you come up to any quest giver, they'll be like, hey, you're from Class Zero, I need your help with this. Being part of this prestigious class is all that matters. So the only cadets I was really able to become familiar with early game were the ones I often played as, or the ones that have salient names.
My name is Deuce.
Oh, the deuce?
So yeah, the first couple hours of Type 0 were kinda rough narratively. No characters I was really attached to, and the first few chapters just have you reclaiming territories from the Militesi Empire. Basic missions in an already familiar story. However, I did appreciate how this game considerably depicts the grittiness of war compared to other entries being a rated M title. You occasionally get blood splattering as people get killed, which is quite shocking to see in a Final Fantasy game. It's even got some strong language.
You just said I could do what I wanted, General. So, I'll do what I want. Yeah! Don't you even think about going out in some blaze of glory, you motherfucker!
Also, as someone who doesn't hate Final Fantasy XIII, I like how Type 0 has a lot of 13 DNA being part of the Fabulanova Crystallis series as well. It shares a lot of the same themes and mythos, focusing on important crystals tied to powerful deities. It was nice seeing terms like Lucy and Falsi again and how they're utilized differently here. In this case, I liked the familiarity. What primarily carried this game for me though is the gameplay. The combat is a real-time action-based system, abilities being tied to the 4 face buttons, square for basic attacks, and circle to dodge as the essentials. A party can have up to 3 cadets, and since there's a total of 14, the other 11 would be reserved for you to switch out whenever a party member goes down. The best character to use though is hands down Ace. He attacks by throwing playing cards that have a really good DPS with no cooldown, so all you need to do is keep your distance from enemies and spam cards until you win. There's other characters that have long range weapons as well, but what gives Ace an edge over all of them is his agility. You see, his dodge is not really a dodge, but a teleportation dash, making him almost untouchable if you perform consecutive dashes. He's just a well balanced unit and very fun to play as. Despite barely having any character, I see why he's a cover boy. You certainly will be using the other cadets, however, each one with a distinct playstyle. If you mess with Ace, you get the Mace, a weapon that deals massive damage but is slow to wield. You kill Machina, you get the Katana. You can play as a samurai, archer, gunslinger, flutist,
What the deuce?
and a mechanic that adds an extra layer to the combat is the break sight. Every enemy type in this game has an attack pattern that will leave themselves open, in which a yellow or red target will appear for a very brief moment if you lock onto them. Yellow means you can do critical damage, and red indicates an opportunity for an instant kill. It's kinda like this game's twist of the stagger mechanic to deal extra damage. If you don't exploit enemies' weaknesses, battles could take a lot longer than they have to be, so the game does require some timing and precision for efficiency to deter mindless button mashing. One issue I did have with the combat though are the camera controls. The camera swings around pretty wildly during battles, especially when you dodge, which you'll be doing a lot this being an action game. It looks like something directed by Michael Bay. It's certainly not bad enough to make the game unplayable. The only time it really bothered me was when I was fighting this dragon boss. I was kinda under level to where it would one-shot me, so it was very important for me to have my eyes on it at all times and not make any mistakes, but the camera kept shifting somewhere else, and it was more infuriating that this was an enemy in the air flying around. It is a fun boss battle though. This whole battle system is solid, it's just slightly held back by crappy camera work. Now let's talk about gameplay outside of combat. In Type 0, you settle into a simple routine of missions and some downtime in between where you'll mostly be unwinding in academia, which is your headquarters. During intermissions, the game will give you a few in-game days to tackle side content before the next operation, and it's not like in Lightning Returns where the clock counts down in real time, but after a specific activity. Time is very much money here. If you talk to the NPCs with exclamation points above their heads, they'll give you a random item and then 2 hours will pass. If you want to be a good student and attend Mog's lectures to gain some stat boosts, it'll cost 2 hours per session. There are also NPCs that have optional tasks for you to do, which I briefly brought up earlier. They're mostly the typical fetch quests and monster slaying side missions that will grant you items or XP for completing them, although they do require more effort than they're worth. I got through this game just fine, barely messing around with accessories, and there's a much quicker method to level up your characters if needed. This game has a feature that I like to call the hyperbolic time chamber because it can get you hours worth of XP within a couple minutes. There's an area in academia where you can drop a character off to train with NPCs so they would gain some XP while you're offline, not playing the game. The longer the time before booting up your game again, the more XP they'll gain, but 24 hours is the limit. A whole real-time day will get a cadet about 3 or 4 levels higher than they were. The thing is though, you can just exploit this feature by manually setting the time on your console a day ahead. If you do this for each cadet for like 10 to 15 minutes, you'll be good to go for the next mission. An expeditious grind. The game also didn't really give me any other incentives to tackle the optional tasks, as there isn't any achievement tied to them or anything, so rarely did I use all my downtime and just initiated the next main mission. You go to briefing and then venture out into the overworld to get to where the operation takes place. Now the overworld is where random encounters occur, which is my absolute favorite, but they can be completely avoided by riding a chocobo, which is the ideal method to traverse the world map anyway, so that's a big plus there. Freely exploring the world on a chocobo while the chocobo theme song's playing, nothing more soothing than that. And I'm happy to say that once you reach chapter 4, the game gets more spicy in terms of both level design and story. Missions start to have more variety, including a couple war mini-games to liberate towns in which you can later visit, but more importantly, the story stops being immensely one-dimensional. Although our protagonists are at war with the Imperials for a majority of this game's run, some conflict between themselves and other nations eventually arise, adding a little more flavor to the narrative. Chapter 4 is the point where I was fully on board with Type 0 for what it is, until the final chapter, Chapter 8. Unfortunately, having Final Fantasy XIII DNA also means this game eventually becomes a convoluted disaster by the end, and it's not that the climax is difficult to follow in itself, it's just that the game doesn't adequately spell things out. As soon as the credits rolled, I had to look up an ending explained, and this could just be me being a dum-dum, but after reading some explanations, I was like, yeah, the game did a terrible job presenting that. Some outside research will probably be necessary to get the full picture, and this was the same case in Final Fantasy XIII. The direction the story takes is interesting. The plot turns out to be much bigger than this war, but regardless of one's comprehension of it, the game without a doubt didn't do enough groundwork to make everything fully cohesive. It brings in some concepts within the last chapter that were never established prior, almost like it forgot it was part of the shared mythology, so it tried to cram all that in at the end, and it certainly fell a little flat. It definitely needed more time to breathe. For what it's worth, I do think the game gave Class Zero a satisfying send-off. The final scene was the only time I felt like there was a bond, a connection between all the cadets, which was emotion eliciting. Very rarely do you get to see all of them together on screen, and it would have been nice if this was present throughout the whole game. Better late than never, I guess. Overall though, this wasn't bad at all. Much better than I was expecting. Before playing this game, I only heard one thing about it from one YouTuber years ago. It was a video of him sharing his collection of PS4 games. He had Type 0, said it wasn't good, and I believed him since this is a Final Fantasy side game that no one really talks about. I thought I was gonna be down the middle with it at best, but I liked it. It's also worth noting that this was originally a PSP game and I got it on sale for like $7, which contributed to my lenience. Expectations are a very influential factor. Just watch me complain more about Final Fantasy XVI in a few months, even though it's gonna be a better game. Come on, Square isn't gonna drop the ball that hard. Anyway, that's all I got for Final Fantasy Type 0, another one in the winner pile. I know my thumbnail and title may have suggested otherwise. If you made it this far into the video, ignore them. Their purpose was to sound remotely clever to maybe get clicks. It's probably why you're here, and now it's time for you to go. See ya.